Germany, winter 1944. The airfield outside Aachen lies silent, beneath a film of frozen mud. Burned-out trucks, shattered fuselages, and the smell of cold oil mark the end of another day in a dying war. A small team of Luftwaffe engineers moves carefully through the wreckage, clipboards under their arms, frost clinging to their coats. Ahead of them rests a captured enemy fighter, half buried in the slush. Its massive radial engine is scorched but intact, its metal skin pitted with holes. They've heard stories of this machine. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a beast that could dive like a stone and still climb back to the clouds. But now, for the first time, they stand before one. With gloved hands, an engineer unlatches the heavy cowling. The metal groans open. Inside, they see the heart of it, a labyrinth of cylinders, wires, and turbo ducts so intricate it seems almost alive. They stare in silence. This wasn't built for elegance. It was built for endurance, for mass production, for a nation that could build 15,000 more just like it. And in that frozen moment, one engineer murmurs, "Now we understand why they never stop coming." By late 1944, the skies over Europe had changed. What once belonged to the Luftwaffe now belonged to the roar of American engines. Every dawn brought another formation of silver bombers, B-17s and B-24s, pushing deeper into the Reich. Behind them, swarms of fighters circled and dove through the thin, cold air, P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, relentless, armored, and seemingly endless. For the Germans on the ground, it was a sight that no longer inspired defiance. It inspired exhaustion. Factories that once produced Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were now silent or buried under rubble. Fuel convoys burned before reaching the airfields. Mechanics stripped old aircraft for parts, praying each flight wouldn't be the last. And above them, the Allied fighters ruled with a kind of mechanical arrogance. Faster, heavier, and always there. The Thunderbolt, in particular, defied everything German engineers believed about design. It was enormous, nearly twice the weight of a Bf-109, as if someone had taken the laws of aerodynamics and thrown them into a furnace. Yet somehow it worked. It climbed, dove, and survived things no other fighter could. German pilots began calling it Der Eiserne Vogel, the Iron Bird. At first, they dismissed it as crude American over-engineering. But when reports came in of P-47s returning to base with holes the size of a man's fist through their wings, still flying true, something changed. The Luftwaffe realized it wasn't luck. It was industrial philosophy. While Germany designed fighters as precision instruments, elegant, efficient, and delicate, America designed them like tools. Every bolt, every line of wiring, every panel on the P-47 was built for repetition, for mass production, for war without end. Deep inside the Reich's crumbling bureaucracy, engineers debated what this meant. How could a country half a world away build thousands of these monsters, while Germany could barely produce fuel for its Messerschmitts? The answer came from the very heart of American industry. In places like Detroit, Buffalo, and Farmingdale, assembly lines worked day and night. Workers who had never seen Europe hammered out engines that could outlast entire Luftwaffe squadrons. The Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double Wasp, the engine inside the Thunderbolt, wasn't just a machine, it was a statement. 18 cylinders, air-cooled, 2,000 horsepower, with a turbo supercharger so advanced it could keep power even at 30,000 feet. And when it failed, there were thousands more waiting in warehouses across the United States. To German engineers used to scarcity, it was unthinkable. They could build marvels like the BMW 801 or the Daimler-Benz 605, but they could never build enough. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was still crafting engines by hand, each one a work of art, each one irreplaceable. America was stamping them out by the tens of thousands, feeding an air war that no longer fought for the sky, but for production itself. The captured P-47 lying outside Aachen was more than an enemy aircraft. It was evidence, proof that the war had already been decided not in dogfights, but in factories. As one German officer later wrote, "When we opened their engines, we didn't find genius. We found numbers." And that was far more terrifying. If stories like this move you, consider subscribing. We'd also love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's dive back into the story. To understand what the German engineers found that day, we need to return to the beginning, to a small design office in Farmingdale, New York, 1940 there. A Georgian-born engineer named Alexander Kartveli sat at his drafting table, sketching what would become one of the most overbuilt fighters in history. He didn't care about elegance, he cared about power. Raw, unrestrained power. The United States Army Air Corps had asked for a new high-altitude interceptor capable of carrying heavy guns, climbing fast, and surviving combat damage. Kartveli's answer was something so large and so radical that early test pilots called it a flying milk jug. But Kartveli understood something few others did. The next war would be fought as much by machines as by men. He had watched the fall of France, studied German tactics, and knew that the only way to win an industrial war was to build aircraft that could survive the impossible and be replaced instantly when lost. That philosophy shaped the P-47 Thunderbolt. At its heart was the Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder, twin-row radial engine that was already powering bombers and large naval aircraft. To make it work in a single-seat fighter, engineers added a turbo-supercharger system that channeled exhaust gases through a network of ducts and compressors all the way to the tail, almost 6 meters. Behind the pilot, the system looked insane on paper, heavy, complicated, and expensive. But when tested, it produced something extraordinary. A fighter that could climb above 30,000 feet and still deliver full power. Most German engines, like the Daimler-Benz DB605, relied on mechanical superchargers which lost efficiency at altitude, but the R-2800's turbo system kept its fury all the way up. A technological miracle built not by one genius, but by the combined might of American industry. For the Luftwaffe, this difference was existential. Their fighters were light, agile, and deadly in short bursts. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, was built for endurance. A 5-ton machine that could absorb punishment, deliver its payload, and fly home through flak and fighters alike. In 1943, when the P-47 first arrived in Europe, German pilots laughed. It was too big, too heavy, and too slow to turn. But within months, their laughter faded. They discovered that the P-47 could dive faster than anything they had, reaching speeds that would tear the wings off most Luftwaffe aircraft. Its 850 caliber machine guns shredded targets on the ground and in the air. And when the Thunderbolt began escorting bombers deep into Germany, the Luftwaffe's margin for survival evaporated. Every time a P-47 went down, 3 more arrived from across the Atlantic. Every time a German squadron was rebuilt, it faced newer, stronger, better-maintained enemy aircraft. By 1944, the Thunderbolt wasn't just a plane, it was the embodiment of American production power. Its factories never slept, its workers never stopped, and its design philosophy had no equivalent in Europe. One captured German report described it bitterly. The enemy does not build fighters as we do. They build factories that build fighters. And that is the greater weapon. When the Luftwaffe engineers pried open that P-47's cowling near Aachen, they weren't just examining an engine. They were looking into the soul of a different kind of war. A war Germany could no longer fight because it could not be mass-produced. The R-2800 was more than metal. It was the rhythm of Detroit assembly lines, the hum of electricity in Buffalo, the hammering of rivets in Farmingdale. Each engine was a piece of a system so vast, so organized, that no amount of precision or genius could stop it. That was the realization that spread quietly among the engineers that winter, the moment the myth of German technical superiority met the truth of industrial scale, when the engineers finally stepped away from the wreck. Their notebooks were filled with sketches and notes, yet none of them could shake the feeling that what they'd just seen wasn't merely engineering. It was philosophy, embodied in metal. The first angle was human. For German designers who had grown up under the legacy of Junkers and Messerschmitt, aircraft were supposed to be beautiful, tight, efficient, mathematically perfect. Every rivet had purpose. Every curve had logic. The P-47, in contrast, looked almost brutal. Thick fuselage, stubby wings, oversized cowling. It was the antithesis of everything they valued. But that ugliness, they now realized, was a kind of genius. The Americans had built a machine that didn't depend on beauty. It depended on function, forgiveness, and the ability to keep flying after everything went wrong. Inside its cockpit, pilots were surrounded by redundancy, dual controls, armored glass, reinforced framing. Even the oxygen and fuel systems had backups. To German engineers who had been forced to cut corners as materials vanished and factories shrank, this was staggering. The Thunderbolt wasn't just strong, it was wasteful by design. But in 1944, America could afford to waste. Germany could not. The second angle was tactical. In combat, the Thunderbolt changed everything. German pilots soon learned that dogfighting it was suicide. It couldn't turn tightly, but it could dive. And nothing could follow it down. The R-2800 engine, built to deliver immense power even at high altitude, allowed P-47s to plummet from 30,000 feet at nearly 900 kilometers per hour, level out, and then climb again before the enemy could react. This boom and zoom tactic made the Thunderbolt a nightmare opponent. Luftwaffe aces accustomed to tight, graceful duels suddenly found themselves chasing shadows that struck once and vanished. In radio chatter, you could hear the disbelief. Der Dicke kommt wieder. The fat one's coming back. But the P-47's role evolved far beyond air combat. When Allied bombers no longer needed constant escort, the Thunderbolt turned its power toward the ground. With bombs under its wings and rockets on its rails, it became the terror of German supply lines, a flying hammer that shredded convoys, locomotives, and even tanks. For frontline troops, the sight of those broad wings overhead meant one thing: survival. For German soldiers on the ground, it meant annihilation from above. Sudden, precise, and relentless. By the summer of 1944, there were more than 5,000 Thunderbolts operating across Europe. They destroyed trains, bridges, and fuel depots faster than they could be rebuilt. The Luftwaffe, bleeding pilots faster than replacements could arrive, watched its empire of air power disintegrate beneath the weight of American industrial persistence. The third angle was psychological. For the pilots who flew it, the P-47 was more than a machine. It was a companion, a fortress in the sky. Lieutenant Robert Johnson once returned to base after being hit by more than 20-millimeter cannon shells. His plane's control cables were shredded, canopy jammed, and fuel leaking. Yet it flew. He called it a miracle, but engineers knew better. It was the product of over-engineering, of margins built for survival. The Thunderbolt inspired confidence. It allowed its pilots to take risks they never could in lighter fighters. That confidence became a weapon of its own. Morale multiplied by horsepower. German pilots felt the opposite. They watched these heavy, noisy, almost clumsy machines take punishment that would destroy any Focke-Wulf or Messerschmitt and still return the next day. Even aces like Adolf Galland admitted the psychological toll. They came in waves. You could shoot one down, and 10 would take its place. You began to wonder if America had a factory for pilots too. By the end of 1944, the engineers who examined that engine near Aachen had seen enough to understand the truth. The Thunderbolt wasn't built to win a duel. It was built to win a war of attrition. Where the Luftwaffe sought perfection, the Americans had built a machine that forgave imperfection. Where Germany designed for mastery, the U.S. designed for manpower. And when the two philosophies collided in the skies of Europe, only one could survive. That realization spread quietly among those who studied the wrecks. Some called it respect. Others called it resignation. But they all agreed on one thing. The P-47 was more than a fighter. It was the reflection of a nation that had turned industry itself into a weapon. If the first impressions of the Thunderbolt were emotional, awe, disbelief, reluctant admiration, what came next was analytical. The engineers needed to understand how this aircraft worked, why it survived, and what made it so different from everything Germany had built before. The fourth angle was technological. Inside the hangars of the Luftwaffe's research division, disassembled pieces of the P-47 lay spread out under harsh lamps. Engineers walked between them, taking notes, tracing wiring with grease-stained fingers. What they saw challenged the very foundation of their design philosophy. The turbo supercharger system, extending all the way to the tail, was like nothing they had ever encountered. It was enormous, heavy, and complex, but perfectly tuned. The airflow through its pipes was calculated to fractions of a millimeter, the cooling ducts balanced with near-mathematical precision. To a German engineer accustomed to compact hand-fitted systems, it looked almost alien, a piece of industry rather than craftsmanship. One analyst reportedly wrote in his field log, "Their power plant is built not for elegance, but for repetition. This is not an aircraft. It is a process." That phrase captured it. The Thunderbolt wasn't about individual excellence. It was about reproducibility. America's factories could build 1,000 identical engines that would all run, all day, in any weather. In Germany, by contrast, each engine was a masterpiece, the product of hand-fit parts and limited materials. A single flaw could cripple a squadron. The fifth angle was industrial. By late 1943, the Allied war machine had become something the Germans could hardly fathom. The U.S. Army Air Forces had ordered more than 12,000 P-47s before the first year of production had even finished. Factories across the United States, in New York, Connecticut, Indiana, and California, all fed the same stream of parts. Women riveters, high school graduates, machinists, and farmers turned into the gears of a system that never slept. For every P-47 that fell into the North Sea, another rolled off the assembly line within hours. Even damaged aircraft were stripped, repaired, and sent back to war faster than the Luftwaffe could replace a single squadron's worth of engines. In Germany, the picture was the opposite. Bombed rail lines slowed everything. Aluminum shortages forced engineers to redesign wings. Synthetic fuel plants worked at half capacity. Every improvement demanded materials that no longer existed. To the engineers examining that Thunderbolt, it was brutally clear. This was the product of an economy designed entirely for war, but without despair. It was war run like business, and business was good. The sixth angle was moral, and it ran deeper than metal among the German team were men who had once believed in technical superiority, the conviction that intellect and precision would always triumph over quantity. But the P-47 forced them to face an uncomfortable truth. A democracy, when fully mobilized, could produce not only weapons but systems, organized, scalable, and relentless. Each bolt in the Thunderbolt represented not just a factory, but a worker's hour, a community's contribution, a nation's decision to industrialize compassion and courage into machines. The war was no longer about genius. It was about endurance, physical, economic, and moral. And endurance was something America possessed in terrifying abundance. As one engineer confided to his superior, watching Allied formations pass overhead, "They have turned production into strategy. Every man, woman, and child is a gear. We cannot fight that." There was one final angle: the human cost. For every Thunderbolt pilot who made it home, others didn't. The aircraft's strength couldn't protect against every flak burst or every lucky 20 mm hit, but its survival rate was astonishing. In the last year of the war, nearly 60% of pilots shot down over Europe returned alive. It wasn't invincibility, it was probability, multiplied by design. German engineers understood probability better than anyone. They saw in those statistics the quiet arithmetic of defeat. Every Thunderbolt that survived a mission meant its pilot could fly again. Every factory that replaced a lost engine meant another sortie tomorrow. Germany could never match that cycle. The engineers' reports would go to Berlin. Some were read, others ignored, drowned in the chaos of retreat. But the message remained. The enemy's greatest weapon was not his plane, but his capacity to build it endlessly. By the time spring came, many of those same engineers were evacuating their laboratories, burning documents and scattering prototypes before the Allies arrived. Some would later work for the United States after the war, standing once again before the R-2800, but this time in a peaceful laboratory. And they would remember that winter day in Aachen, when they first opened the cowling of a P-47 and realized the war had already been lost, not in the skies, but in the factories behind them. The report that left Aachen in early 1945 moved quietly through what remained of the Luftwaffe's command structure. It was written in calm, technical language: voltages, pressures, airflow ratios. But its conclusion was unmistakable. The enemy possesses an air power system beyond our present capacity to counter. That single sentence reached Berlin just as the skies above Germany turned silver. Every day, new squadrons of Thunderbolts arrived. Fresh paint, fresh engines, fresh pilots. They filled the airfields of liberated France and Belgium like a tide that could not be stopped. Their mission had changed. They were no longer just fighters. They were executioners of infrastructure. The once proud Luftwaffe airfields, Werl, Merseburg, Paderborn, now served as targets. Thunderbolts struck oil refineries, train depots, ammunition dumps, convoys, and even communication lines. Every bridge destroyed meant fewer supplies for the front. Every train burned meant fewer tanks could move. In weeks, the arteries of Germany's war machine began to collapse. And all of it, every bombing raid and strafing run, was powered by the same heart. The Pratt and Whitney R-2800, spinning beneath the P-47's broad nose like an industrial anthem. Inside the Luftwaffe's technical bureau, senior engineers gathered to discuss the captured P-47. They had examined the materials: high-strength aluminum alloys, synthetic rubbers, machined steel from America's industrial heartland. What stunned them most wasn't the engine's power. It was its consistency. Every bolt had the same markings. Every bearing fit precisely as the next. They could tell. This wasn't handmade. It was assembly line perfection, the kind that could only come from a nation that treated aircraft not as art, but as output. In a meeting that February, one German scientist reportedly turned to his peers and said, "We have the knowledge to build such a plane. What we lack is a nation capable of doing it 10,000 times." That was the moment the Luftwaffe's engineers realized that even their brilliance could not alter the outcome. The war was no longer a contest of innovation. It was a contest of replication. Meanwhile, above the frozen rivers of Germany, the Thunderbolts carved their legacy. Operation Cobra, Market Garden, the Ardennes. In each of these campaigns, the P-47 proved its worth not as a dogfighter, but as the sledgehammer of Allied air power. During the Battle of the Bulge, American ground forces pinned down in the forests of Belgium called desperately for air support. When the clouds broke, the sky filled with Thunderbolts, their wings loaded with bombs, rockets, and machine guns. They tore through German armor columns, turning what could have been a catastrophic defeat into a bloody stalemate. And then, a victory. German tank crews began to dread the distinctive whistle of the P-47's dive. It was a sound that meant death, one soldier wrote home. When the fat American comes down, the earth itself runs away. But while soldiers felt the destruction, the engineers felt something more haunting: inevitability. They watched their own production lines crumble under Allied bombing. They saw the shortages of tungsten, rubber, high-octane fuel, and they knew that even if they designed a miracle machine, it would be too late, too few, too fragile. The Thunderbolt had shown what war looked like when industry, logistics, and manpower aligned into one rhythm. It was no longer about who had the best aircraft. It was about who could keep them in the air day after day without pause. The R-2800 engines didn't just outlast the Germans. They outproduced them. In 1944 alone, the United States manufactured over 20,000 of them, more than Germany's total fighter engine output that entire year. For every skilled German craftsman filing a piston by hand, there were hundreds of American workers operating machines that turned out parts with mathematical precision. The Luftwaffe could not match that tempo. No one could. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine, the German engineers' reports became little more than relics of a lost argument. Their warnings went unread, their findings archived, their pride quietly broken. In one final memorandum, an aging engineer summarized their conclusion in a line that would outlive the war itself. The enemy's aircraft was not the triumph of design, it was the triumph of organization. That sentence, understated and cold, captured the true climax of the air war. The moment when intellect bowed to industry, and art gave way to arithmetic. The Luftwaffe still had brave pilots, skilled mechanics, and visionary minds. But they no longer had a nation capable of sustaining them. And above them, the sky belonged to a machine that had no equal in its endurance. The P-47 Thunderbolt, born of metal, manpower, and an unending supply chain. By March 1945, the skies over Western Europe had become a living map of American industry. Each roar of a P-47's engine was the echo of a factory thousands of miles away. Each contrail stretching across the gray German sky was drawn by a nation that had mastered the art of endless supply. The Luftwaffe, once the sharp edge of blitzkrieg, now staggered on its knees. Fuel was rationed, airfields abandoned, and pilots, Some, barely trained, flew on borrowed time. The engineers who had once built the pride of German aviation now dismantled wrecks for spare parts, trying to keep even a handful of aircraft serviceable. And yet, the P-47s kept coming. They arrived in squadrons of 12, then 20, then 50. A storm of engines and metal that no anti-aircraft battery could fully repel. To the civilians below, they were thunder given form. To the engineers studying their fragments, they were the sound of inevitability. In late March, a captured Thunderbolt was transported from Aachen to a testing facility near Dessau, one of the last functioning Luftwaffe research centers. The facility was nearly empty now. Laboratories half ruined, instruments missing, documents burned in fear of Allied raids. But even amid the ruin, curiosity persisted. A handful of engineers, veterans of Germany's great aircraft programs, gathered around the battered fuselage to conduct one final dissection. They removed the armor plating, the canopy glass, the thick control cables. Each part told the same story. Scale, simplicity, mass production. Then they opened the engine once more. The Pratt & Whitney R2800, still blackened from fire, yet unbroken in form. What they found inside left them silent. The tolerances were immaculate. Every joint, every coupling, every line was machined to a standard they could scarcely maintain under bombardment. Even the labeling was industrially consistent. Stamped markings, serial codes, batch numbers, proof that thousands of identical components existed somewhere across the ocean. One of them whispered, "We could build this once. They can build it forever." That was the revelation. Not the power of the engine itself, but the system that stood behind it. At the same time, Allied intelligence teams were studying German technology with equal fascination. Captured Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt aircraft impressed them. Beautifully designed, elegant, precise. But even American analysts noted the same flaw. Fragility. Where a Thunderbolt could be dented, patched, and flown again, a damaged FW-190 was often scrapped. One mechanic put it plainly. Theirs are built like watches. Ours are built like tractors. And tractors win wars. That difference defined the climax of the air war. As Germany's fuel reserves vanished, the Luftwaffe fought shorter, smaller battles, bursts of brilliance fading into silence. Meanwhile, P-47 squadrons swept from France to the Rhine, clearing roads, strafing rail lines, and obliterating convoys. Entire German divisions vanished under their attacks. In April alone, Thunderbolts flew over 130,000 sorties, dropping more than 20,000 tons of bombs and firing millions of rounds. It was industrial war distilled into motion. Fuel, metal, manpower, and will all synchronized into thunder. Inside Germany's collapsing command structure, the engineers' reports became part of a quiet reckoning. They no longer discussed new designs. They discussed survival. Some burned their documents before the Allies arrived, unwilling to let their work become trophies. Others packed notebooks and fled east, hoping to find refuge in Soviet territory or in the American zones that would follow. But before they left, many paused before that captured P-47 one last time. They had opened it, studied it, measured it, and in it they saw not defeat by ingenuity, but defeat by scale. Every component, every piston, every bolt was a reminder that Germany's war had been fought on the wrong terms. They had tried to fight with masterpieces. America had fought with machines. By the first week of May, Allied aircraft, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Lightnings, blanketed the skies from Normandy to Berlin. The Reich was broken. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, existed only in fragments. And somewhere outside Dessau, The engineers who had once led its innovation stood watching the contrails fade into the clouds. One of them was overheard saying quietly, "The war was never in the air. It was in the factories, and that's where we lost it." That statement would later resurface in post-war interviews, a quiet admission of a truth learned too late. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't win through elegance or fear. It won through persistence, through the unending heartbeat of 1,000 engines roaring across continents, each one born from a nation that understood the future of war was not invention, but production. As the Allies advanced and Germany crumbled, the story of the Thunderbolt became more than an account of a single aircraft. It became the turning point in the philosophy of war itself, the moment when industry became strategy, and power was measured not by brilliance, but by how many times it could be replicated. May 1945. Germany was silent. The guns had fallen quiet, the skies emptied, and the roads were littered with the remains of what had once been the most advanced air force in the world. In hangars across the shattered Reich, twisted wrecks of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs lay beside the wreckage of captured Allied planes. Each one a relic of a war, fought as much in design offices as on battlefields. Among them, the P-47 Thunderbolt stood like a monument to inevitability. The engineers who had examined it during those final months were now scattered, some in Allied custody, others trying to survive in the ruins of their own creation. When interrogated by American officers, their words carried a strange mixture of bitterness and admiration. One former Luftwaffe designer, Dr. Ernst Koenig, told his captors, "When we saw your engines, we understood that no matter how skilled we could not fight your factories." The Americans didn't gloat. They didn't have to. The proof was everywhere, in the thousands of Thunderbolts lined wingtip to wingtip across Allied airfields in France, Belgium, and England. Machines of war, yes, but also machines of endurance. As the Allies advanced into Germany, teams of technical intelligence officers catalogued everything: blueprints, engines, prototypes, fuel systems. In the ruins of Dessau, they found the notes from the engineers who had studied the captured P-47. The papers were smudged, partly burned, but the meaning was clear. Detailed sketches of the R-2800, annotations in German, and calculations of airflow and boost pressure. One American officer, reading the translated report, remarked, "They respected it. That's how you know it frightened them." And it did. The Germans had built faster planes, sleeker planes, more agile planes, but none could endure like the Thunderbolt. Where German pilots fought with precision, American pilots fought with logistics at their backs. Every P-47 in the sky represented not just a pilot, but a network of factories, railroads, refineries, and workers across a continent. For every German aircraft destroyed, another Allied one took off. The balance of war had shifted long before the final battles were fought. After the surrender, as the Allies divided the spoils of technology, the Thunderbolt became a study in contrast. American teams pored over the Me-262 jet, the V-2 rockets, the exotic alloys, marvels of desperate innovation. But to the Germans who saw both sides, the lesson was humbler and clearer. Innovation without resources was a dead end. The P-47 wasn't revolutionary in shape or theory. It was revolutionary in scale, in the way it turned the chaos of war into an industrial routine. The Luftwaffe had fought for mastery. The Americans had fought for momentum, and momentum had won. By war's end, over 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts had been built. They had flown more than 500,000 sorties, destroyed thousands of locomotives, tanks, and aircraft, and helped grind down the enemy's ability to resist. To the German engineers who once opened that engine cowling and stared into its labyrinth of steel, the memory remained vivid. They hadn't simply uncovered a machine, they had uncovered the blueprint of a new world. One where wars would no longer be decided by brilliance, but by who could build faster, longer, and larger. When the war ended, many of the same German engineers who had once studied the Thunderbolt were taken into Allied custody, not as prisoners, but as minds worth preserving. Under Operation Paperclip and Soviet counterpart programs, they were quietly absorbed into the new technological race that was already forming. One no longer about propellers, but about jets and rockets. In that strange new peace, they found themselves in American laboratories, walking past the very engines they had once studied with envy. Some now worked alongside the men who had designed them. Pratt and Whitney engineers refining the R-2800 into post-war models for the F-4U Corsair and the Douglas Skyraider. One German mechanic reportedly stood in silence for a long time, resting his hand on a new R-2800, whispering, "It has not changed, but everything else has." For the Americans, the Thunderbolt was already passing into history. Jet aircraft like the F-80 and F-84 were beginning to take its place, sleek and fast. Children of the very technological principles both sides had advanced during the war. But the legacy of the P-47 remained. It had proven something fundamental, that reliability and production could outfight precision and genius. It had demonstrated that a war of machines was ultimately a war of numbers, and that the side that could repair, replace, and reproduce would always rise from the ashes. In post-war Germany, those who had examined the P-47 wrote about it in memoirs and debriefings, quietly, often reluctantly. They described it not as an enemy, but as a mirror, a reflection of what Germany could have been, had it not pursued complexity over capacity, perfection over practicality. Dr. Hans Mauch, an aeronautical engineer who later testified at Allied hearings, summed it in one line: "We lost to an engine, not because it was better, but because there were too many of them." Those words captured the new reality of warfare. The age of the craftsman-engineer had ended. The age of the system engineer had begun. In the decades that followed, that shift would define everything, from Cold War rearmament to the space race. Every satellite, every jet, every missile owed something to that transformation, to the idea that mastery in war was no longer about the brilliance of a few, but the coordination of millions. In museums today, the P-47 sits quietly, its wings gleaming under restored light. Visitors see it as a relic, an oversized fighter from another time. But those who know its story see something deeper, a turning point. The German engineers who once opened its engine and found the heart of an empire understood this truth better than most. They had not just examined a machine, they had looked directly into the engine of the American century. That day in the mud outside Aachen, they didn't simply uncover an aircraft. They uncovered the future. In the stillness that followed the war, when the smoke cleared and the factories fell silent, the world began to count what it had built and what it had lost. The P-47 Thunderbolt remained, not as a symbol of destruction, but of transformation. It had proven that victory in the modern age would belong not to the fastest or the most elegant, but to those who could endure, those who could turn industry, manpower, and will into one single motion. For the German engineers who once opened its cowling, that realization came too late. They had seen into the heart of something larger than technology, a civilization's capacity to organize itself. Inside that tangled web of wires and steel, they glimpsed not genius, but coordination. Not artistry, but scale. In that sense, the Thunderbolt was more than an aircraft. It was a message, a mechanical expression of what democracy, when mobilized, could achieve. It was the sound of collective strength, the roar of an industrial nation that fought with both conscience and machinery. And yet, there is a quiet tragedy beneath its legacy. For all its power, the Thunderbolt was still a vessel of war, built by human hands, flown by young men who never came home. It embodied the best and worst of what humanity can create when survival becomes necessity. Today, when we see its broad wings in museums or hear the echo of its engine in documentaries, we are reminded of that balance, of what progress costs, and what endurance demands. The German engineers had opened a machine. What they found was the beating heart of an idea. That strength, in the end, is not in invention alone, but in the unity behind it. Subscribe to WWW Tales Stories and join us as we uncover more untold moments of courage, loss, and discovery from the Second World War. What part of this story struck you most? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read your take.